There's quite an interesting harassment case this week, a civil claim for harassment, and it raises a very interesting issue, which is it a defence to harassment that you are trying to detect or prevent or investigate crime? So let me explain the background to it. It all arises out of what happened at the Ariana Grande concert some years back. And as you may be aware, there was an explosion, to put it neutrally, and a number of people were unalived, to use that horrible word, and severely injured. But some people suspected there was something not quite right with it, basically all the conspiracy theory people. And one particular chap, a Mr. Hall, he set out to prove how it was all fake. It had never happened. It was all at the behest of the security services, and all the people involved, they were crisis actors. They had either never been hurt, or they'd been hurt in other situations, and they were just pretending they were hurt in that one, or they were children that people decided they wanted to sell abroad. So they kidnapped all these children, sold them off, and then said, aha, we'll just pretend that they all lost their lives at the Ariana Grande concert. And there's one particular family, there was a guy, he himself had been really severely injured, in fact, and he was paralysed from the waist down. And his daughter also suffered terrible, terrible, terrible injuries. I mean, they actually, at the scene, they thought they covered her up because they thought she was gone. As it happened, it turned out she was alive. So even though it took an hour and 3/4 to get her to the hospital, she did miraculously survive, albeit with hideous injuries. But she's trying to build a life for herself. She's going to college. She's in a wheelchair now. She has trouble. At first she couldn't speak for 2 years, but eventually they managed to recover her speech. And she's doing quite well. But the problem was, this guy started investigating. And he was doing things like he was sneaking up to their houses. He wanted to catch them out in a lie. So there were allegations that he had surreptitiously planted cameras on their property. Now, in fairness, it turned out he tried to plant one in a flower bed or a flower pot, but then they'd seen him and he'd gone away. But he had actually filmed from his car. He set a camera up in his car and then went up and he was knocking on the door. They didn't want anything to do with him, but then he went around speaking to the neighbours. The neighbours were all quite surprised, because they didn't know anything about this. He was saying, oh, can you tell me about your neighbours who are faking all these injuries? And say, because they hadn't actually told any of their neighbours what had happened, because this was a very traumatic thing. And the poor girl especially, she had PTSD, and everything, reminded her of it, would trigger her. So they just wanted to have as normal a life as possible. So because of that, they hadn't disclosed to anybody how she suffered her injuries, because they didn't want even caring people saying, oh, what was it like, and all that sort of thing. They just wanted to leave that alone. But he did all this. He stalked them. He was putting all sorts of accusations about them on social media. He wrote a book. Now, he did actually send 5 copies of his book to the inquiry and said, hey, look at this, you should be investigating this. But anyway, they got sick to death of this because people, were jumping on the bandwagon. And they actually felt scared, because we've seen with like the Alex Jones thing and Sandy Hook, there were people going, oh, you're just doing this to have our guns taken away. And they became a target. It became not just they were being harassed by this guy, but other people were claiming that they were crisis actors, and they felt under threat. So they sued him in harassment and also for GDPR, breach of personal information. And this week we had the ruling on the harassment element. They kicked the GDPR private information bit to be dealt with later. I suspect that will actually now go away now they've succeeded on this limb. But he raised a number of defences. First of all, he said his conduct was reasonable. And he also said, well, I am investigating a crime. These people are involved in a huge conspiracy and cover-up. So the court approached this. First of all, they said, well, it's not what you think is reasonable. It's, would an average, ordinary person knowing all the facts think what you were doing was reasonable? And they say, well, even on your own account, why did you need to do this? Okay, you were trying to interview them and catch them out, but you were surreptitiously recording, you were asking people, you were breaching their privacy. So that's unreasonable. And because, you were doing lots of different things, this amounts to a course of conduct, which is something else you have to show for harassment. He said, yeah, but I'm investigating a crime. And it is true that actually that is a defence to harassment proceedings. You know, you are doing it to prevent or detect or reveal crime. But what's the standard? Is it subjective? Can you just say, well, deluded and as I am, I honestly, genuinely believe a crime has been committed and therefore that's my get out of jail free card? Or is there an objective element to it? Does that have to be reasonable? And it's very tricky because all the authorities up to date do sort of suggest that it doesn't really matter if somebody's incorrect or it's a daft theory. You know, you don't have to objectively be correct or there be a crime. You just have to arguably legit be thinking you're investigating a crime. Because a lot of the time you won't know if it's a crime until you have investigated, will you? He's just saying, I was suspicious, I want to get to the truth of this. I'm filming this right on the beach and I thought the tide was going out, but it clearly isn't. So I'll wrap up reasonably quickly. Now, I think this is another one of those cases where the court said, you know, we basically want this claim to succeed so we can injunct this guy and stop him doing that. So what they actually said is, they actually did him on the, pretty much, they said, okay, there is a subjective element to this. If you were, I could argue you were honestly doing this to prevent or investigate crime, then, you know, that would be a defence. But your own actions weren't, because all you were doing was bad-mouthing these people on social media and, you know, doing YouTube things and, you know, getting lots of likes and lots of clicks. A bit like, you know, Alex Jones saying, you know, these people are scammers and it's all a huge conspiracy. Now, interestingly, of course, he had sent his book to the inquiry and said, read this. And I think that was his strongest point, that, look, I want the authorities to do something about this. So they effectively found that what he was doing, because he hadn't reported it to the authorities or he hadn't sort of, you know, done anything on the back of it, he was just announcing this to the world, that he wasn't doing it to detect or investigate crime. And I do think, you know, that's I'm certainly not disagreeing with the decision. I think they certainly got the right decision. But it's interesting that it does seem to be a little bit of a workaround, because the law was quite in his favour. Because, like I say, it's a very low threshold to say you are investigating and investigating crime. But in this particular case, it said your actions were incompatible with you actually investigating crime, as opposed to just doing this, you know, to get clicks. I mean, the other thing is that I didn't intend to harass anybody either, but they said no, because that's an objective test. Once you've lost all your defences, it's not for you to say what your intention was, it's would an average ordinary person say this amounts to harassment or not, and in this particular case the court said yes, it does. So there will be an award of damages, but perhaps for the family the more important thing is they will get the injunction saying stop harassing this family, stop surreptitiously filming them, and stop putting things on social media accusing them of a conspiracy. I mean, this actually reminds me, because I was around when the Harassment Act came in, and I had one of the very first cases, and my client, she's actually an ex-model. I won't go into too many details, but she lived in some very posh, swanky flats. And there was another couple there, this couple of gentlemen, and she'd been posting all sorts of letters accusing them of all sorts of hideous offences and crimes. You know, all sorts of inappropriate behaviour with young people. No evidence whatsoever for that. Now, actually, because at the time the law was very unclear, the Act had just come in, I actually had to ask, and this was in a magistrate's court, and because it was quite legalistic, they actually put what was then called a stipendiary magistrate, now a district judge, a professional magistrate, you know, legally qualified. And I said, well, can we just clarify that if I was to ask, why did you do this? And some of the prosecutors stood and said, oh, no, hang on. We're not having you telling her what to say. I said, I'm not trying to do that. He said, no, she has to leave the room while we discuss this. And the judge said, well, no, she's in the dock. She has a right to hear her entire trial. I said, just to clarify, though, if I was to say, why did you do this? And she said, to prevent, prevent them committing crimes and to alert people that, you know, there's crimes going on and to draw it to attention, that, you know, they said, well, yeah, that would be a defence. So it's like, okay, so here we go. So she gives evidence, I ask the question and say, now, you did all this, it's not in dispute you did this, but tell me, why did you do this? And she went, because I hate them. And you just saw the judge just sort of like go, yeah, well, you deserve that answer. Yeah, so she was convicted on that. But like I say, this was back in the days before we had a lot of case law on this. So it'd be interesting to see, I'd be interested to see if he appeals this, because annoying as it is to say, bearing in mind what a completely odious person he is, in my opinion, based on the facts that have been reported in that case, I do think his behaviour is completely out of order. But yeah, I do suspect that he actually does have a ground of appeal there on the basis that by notifying the inquiry and sending his books, he can argue, whatever I did, ultimately, that was my aim, was to bring it to the relevant authorities. But we will have to see. So as always, hope you found that vaguely useful, vaguely interesting, and again, probably wildly infuriating. Weird people out there, aren't there? And where am I? I'm just back at Porthleven again. So there's a lovely church behind. When it's really stormy here, like the waves crash over that church. But you can have a look at the sea. There you go. So that's what the sea's doing at the moment. And there's some rather nice rocks here. Oh, look at that sunshine. And that's Porthleven over there. And we'll finish on a nice shot of the church.